Brock Lesnar had just finished an intense training session at a small gym on the outskirts of town. He was tired, his muscles sore, but he felt alive in the way only a fighter knows. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets, and the usual city noise had quieted down. Brock enjoyed these moments, walking through the neighborhood on his own, taking in the simple things, the smell of freshly baked bread from a corner bakery, the laughter of children playing a few blocks away, the distant hum of traffic. It was a normal evening, and he looked forward to getting home, taking a shower, and settling into a quiet night. As he turned down a quieter street, he noticed a police car parked slightly askew near the curb. The officer inside was looking around, seemingly alert to something Brock couldn't see. Brock slowed his pace, thinking it was just routine. But then the car door opened and the officer stepped out, walking towards him with a stern expression. Brock tried to keep his demeanor calm, hoping this would just be a simple check. The officer stopped a few feet in front of him and immediately started speaking in a sharp tone. Brock could tell from the way the words came out that the officer was frustrated or maybe had a bad day. Brock answered politely, explaining that he had just finished training and was on his way home. He expected the conversation to be short and straightforward, but the officer didn't seem interested in listening. He accused Brock of being in the area for suspicious reasons, even though Brock had no connection to anything untoward. Brock raised his hand slightly in a gesture of calm, showing he wasn't a threat. He tried to reason with the officer, explaining that he lived nearby and had just been at the gym. Brock's voice was firm but respectful, hoping that clarity and honesty would be enough, but the officer wasn't listening. His tone grew louder, more aggressive, and his posture became rigid. Brock noticed the tension rising, not just in the officer, but in himself too. He had faced many fights in the ring, but this was different. There was no referee, no rules, only a misunderstanding that could escalate quickly if handled incorrectly. Some people walking by slowed down, sensing that something was happening, but they didn't step in. Brock understood that most people were cautious when it came to police confrontations. Still, he could feel the eyes of a few bystanders on him, curious but hesitant. The street that had felt calm and familiar only moments ago now seemed charged, every shadow and passing sound adding to the tension. Brock's mind raced as he tried to keep the situation under control. He reminded himself not to react in anger, no matter how unfair the situation felt. He had been trained to stay composed under pressure, and this was a test of a different kind, one of patience and restraint rather than strength or aggression. He kept his voice steady, repeating that he wanted to cooperate fully but that he also wanted to be treated with respect. The officer ignored his words and took a step closer, his body language more confrontational. Brock held his ground, making sure to keep his hands visible and his stance relaxed. He didn't want to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation further. He noticed a slight shift in the expressions of the onlookers. Some seemed anxious while others whispered among themselves, wondering how this would unfold. Brock knew that the way he handled this moment could influence not just the outcome for himself, but also the reaction of the crowd and the officer. As the conversation continued, Brock sensed that the officer was trying to assert control over the situation. It wasn't about justice or fairness anymore, it was about authority. Brock realized that arguing aggressively would only make things worse. Instead, he chose to speak calmly and clearly, stating facts and emphasizing his intention to cooperate. He mentioned that he had just left the gym, that he was a local resident, and that he had no reason to be suspicious. Each word was measured, aimed at de-escalating rather than provoking. The officer, however, seemed determined to challenge him. He questioned Brock's story, repeating accusations that made little sense. Brock could feel frustration rising inside him, but he forced himself to stay composed. He reminded himself that this wasn't a fight he could win with fists or force. This was about restraint, about keeping the situation under control while still standing his ground. He noticed the officer's gestures becoming more aggressive, and the air between them felt tight, like a spring ready to snap. Brock's mind briefly wandered to the many times he had faced opponents in the ring. In those moments, he knew that staying calm, observing the opponent, and waiting for the right moment to act were key. He realized the same principles applied here. He didn't need to dominate the officer. He needed to maintain his composure, to show that he was not a threat, and to rely on reason and honesty to navigate the confrontation. The crowd of onlookers had grown slightly. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing that something important was happening. Brock noticed this and felt a mix of relief and pressure. On one hand, witnesses could prevent the situation from escalating unfairly. On the other hand, their presence added a layer of scrutiny that made every word and gesture matter. Brock decided to continue speaking in a calm and respectful tone, hoping that reason would eventually prevail. The officer paused for a moment, and Brock seized the opportunity to explain again, calmly and clearly. He spoke about his day, his training, and his simple plans for the evening. He emphasized that he had no intention of causing trouble and wanted to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. Brock's voice carried a quiet authority, not because he was threatening, but because he was confident in his truth and his approach. The tension in the air remained thick, but Brock noticed a subtle change. The officer's rigid posture softened slightly, though his tone was still sharp. The bystanders whispered among themselves, sensing a shift. Brock understood that the confrontation was at a turning point. It could either escalate into something worse or begin to de-escalate. He continued to focus on calm communication. Paddy Brock Lesnar had barely caught his breath when he realized the tension hadn't fully dissipated. The officer, though momentarily holding back, still had a rigid expression, and the air felt heavy with unspoken frustration. Brock continued to walk slowly, careful not to make sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. He kept his hands visible, relaxed, and moved in a way that showed he was calm but alert. The street, once quiet and familiar, now seemed alive with silent anticipation. Every person nearby felt the weight of the situation, and Brock sensed that everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Brock knew he had to maintain his composure. He had faced opponents who tried to intimidate him with size, reputation, and aggression, and he understood that panic or anger could be dangerous. He reminded himself that this wasn't about fighting or proving dominance. It was about patience, clarity, and using calm communication to navigate a difficult situation. He spoke softly but firmly, reiterating that he was just walking home from training and had no reason to be confronted. His words were steady, carrying a quiet authority that only comes from confidence in one's own truth. The officer's voice remained sharp, but Brock noticed subtle changes in his posture. The aggressive energy hadn't vanished, but there was a flicker of hesitation. Brock sensed that the officer was trying to assert control, but was now aware of the witnesses around them. A few bystanders had moved closer, curious and concerned, quietly observing the interaction. Some had even taken out their phones to record what was happening. Brock understood the influence of these silent witnesses. Their presence could either hold the officer accountable or increase tension if he felt cornered. Brock's mind worked quickly. He thought about the best way to de-escalate the situation further. He didn't want to provoke or confront the officer directly, but he also couldn't let the accusations continue unchecked. He began speaking in a calm, deliberate tone, making sure each word was clear. He explained again where he had been, why he was in the area, and that he was a local resident. He emphasized his willingness to cooperate, but insisted on being treated fairly and with respect. The officer took a step back, though his expression remained guarded. Brock noticed a few people in the crowd whispering among themselves, sharing concern for what might happen next. The murmurs seemed to ripple through the air, giving Brock a sense that the community around them cared, even in small ways, about what was unfolding. He realized that this was more than just a personal encounter. It was a moment where fairness, restraint, and courage intersected in public view. Brock's thoughts returned to the importance of patience. He reflected on how easily misunderstandings could spiral out of control, especially when one side was intent on asserting authority rather than listening. He chose his words carefully, making sure to stay firm without being aggressive. He wanted the officer to understand that escalating the situation would not benefit anyone. Each sentence Brock spoke was meant to calm, explain, and redirect the tension toward resolution. The crowd seemed to sense the shift. Some people nodded subtly, as if to reassure Brock that he was handling things the right way. Others held their phones a little higher, recording the moment, perhaps hoping that these recordings would prevent unfair treatment. Brock appreciated the quiet support, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. He knew that BS actions were being watched closely and that staying calm was critical. Despite the tension, Brock's focus never wavered. He continued to speak with clarity, addressing the officer directly but without challenging him aggressively. He repeated his willingness to cooperate fully, his desire to resolve the misunderstanding, and his hope that this encounter could end peacefully. Brock could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he refused to let it dictate his behavior. His training, experience, and mental discipline allowed him to maintain control even when the energy around him was chaotic. Minutes passed like hours. The officer seemed torn between maintaining authority and responding to the calm confidence Brock displayed. Brock noticed small gestures, the officer's hands relaxing slightly, his voice wavering at times, his steps less rigid. These small changes indicated that Brock's approach was beginning to work. By staying composed and reasoned, he was gradually influencing the situation in a positive direction. The pedestrians around them played a quiet but crucial role. Some offered verbal support to Brock, asking the officer if everything was all right or gently questioning the need for confrontation. Brock remained focused on the officer, but he felt reassured knowing he was not entirely alone. The presence of others who were willing to stand by fairness and reason added a layer of protection and accountability. Brock's mind remained sharp. He considered every possibility, every movement, every tone of voice. He realized that this encounter was teaching him lessons about patience, empathy, and human behavior outside the ring. He thought about how fear and aggression can escalate situations unnecessarily, and how calm, measured responses can sometimes achieve what force never could. He spoke with sincerity, ensuring that his words reflected truth and respect. The officer, now under the watchful eyes of both Brock and the witnesses, seemed to reconsider his approach. He asked a few questions, his tone slightly less aggressive, as if trying to understand Brock's story. Brock answered clearly and patiently, aware that any sign of irritation could undo the progress he had made. He maintained eye contact, showing confidence without challenging the officer, demonstrating that he was firm in his truth and yet not confrontational. The street, once a backdrop for tension and uncertainty, now held a sense of cautious attention. Pedestrians slowed their pace, watching the interaction unfold. Curious and concerned, Brock could sense the collective hope that the encounter would end without conflict. This shared energy, subtle as it was, seemed to influence the officer as well. The presence of witnesses reminded him that the situation was not private and that accountability mattered. Brock continued to explain, calmly but persistently, until he felt a shift in the dynamic. The officer's gestures became less rigid, his voice more even. Brock recognized that patience and clarity were slowly turning the situation toward resolution. He kept speaking in a calm, human-centric way, emphasizing understanding, cooperation, and fairness. He refrained from expressing frustration, knowing that emotional reactions could escalate tension. As the minutes passed, Brock felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The situation, once tense and unpredictable, was moving toward a peaceful resolution. The officer, while still guarded, seemed to acknowledge Brock's honesty and composure. Brock remained vigilant, understanding that the encounter was not over until it was fully resolved, but he also recognized that his approach was working. Brock's focus on calm communication, patience, and reason created a ripple effect. The crowd responded subtly. The officer adjusted his tone, and the energy of the street began to normalize. Brock understood that courage in this moment was not about aggression or dominance, but about standing firm in truth and handling the situation with dignity. Every step he took, every word he spoke, reflected a balance of strength and restraint. Finally, after what felt like a long struggle of words and gestures, Brock noticed that the officer's posture had softened noticeably. Brock Lesnar moved cautiously down the street, still feeling the aftershocks of the tense encounter. The officer had stepped back, but Brock knew that the situation was far from over. The tension lingered like a heavy fog, and every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the soft shuffle of a pedestrian's shoes, the hum of a passing car, seemed amplified. Brock's senses were alert, trained to notice even the smallest changes in body language or tone. He understood that remaining calm and observant was key to ensuring the situation didn't escalate again. As he walked, Brock noticed the faces of the bystanders. Some were still watching intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Others whispered quietly to each other, perhaps speculating about what had happened. Brock appreciated the subtle support. understanding that the presence of witnesses often influenced how authority figures behaved. He continued to walk slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Every step he took was a conscious effort to convey calm, confidence, and composure. The officer followed at a distance, still keeping a watchful eye on Brock. It was clear that the tension had not completely faded, and Brock knew he had to handle this carefully. He spoke in a calm voice, addressing the officer directly but without challenging him. Brock explained again that he was simply heading home, had no intention of causing trouble, and hoped that this misunderstanding could end peacefully. His words were steady and clear, designed to reduce tension rather than provoke it. Brock could sense a subtle shift in the officer's demeanor. The rigid posture began to soften, and the harsh tone of voice was replaced by a quieter, more measured one. Brock realized that his calm approach was beginning to work. He continued to speak with patience and clarity, emphasizing his willingness to cooperate and his desire for fairness. At the same time, he remained vigilant, ready to respond appropriately if the situation took a turn for the worse. The street around them remained quiet, but charged with a certain energy. Passers-by slowed down, curious about what was unfolding, and some stopped to watch. Brock noticed a few people holding their phones, recording the encounter. He understood the significance of these recordings. They could provide accountability and ensure that the situation was handled properly. The awareness of being observed by the community added a layer of reassurance, but also a subtle pressure to continue handling the situation with integrity. Brock's thoughts wandered briefly to his experiences in the ring. In wrestling and fighting, he had learned that staying calm under pressure was just as important as physical strength. He realized that the same principles applied here, even though the stakes were different. Patience, clarity, and controlled responses could prevent unnecessary escalation and help guide the situation toward resolution. He continued speaking calmly, reinforcing his point that he was a local resident, had no reason to cause trouble, and wanted to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. The officer, still following at a distance, began to ask questions in a quieter tone. Brock answered each one with patience, making sure his words were clear and respectful. He avoided any hint of frustration, knowing that even the smallest sign of anger could reignite tension. His focus remained on de-escalation, on demonstrating that he was cooperative and respectful, and on maintaining control of his own emotions. Brock's calmness was beginning to influence the surrounding energy, subtly shifting the dynamic from confrontation to cautious understanding. As they walked, Brock noticed the subtle reactions of the crowd. Some nodded slightly as if acknowledging his composure. Others whispered quietly, commenting on the unusual scene. Brock appreciated the silent support, understanding that even indirect encouragement could influence how the officer behaved. He continued to maintain eye contact with the officer, speaking in a calm and measured tone. Every word was carefully chosen to convey honesty, cooperation, and patience. The officer's questions began to soften in tone, and his body language suggested that he was starting to reassess the situation. Brock remained steady, careful not to misinterpret the subtle changes. He knew that patience and consistent calm behavior were key to guiding the situation toward a positive outcome. He continued to explain his day, his routine, and his simple plans for the evening, making sure the officer understood that there was no threat and no reason for suspicion. Brock could feel the tension in the air gradually easing. The officer's aggressive energy was diminishing, replaced by a cautious attentiveness. Brock maintained his calm demeanor, reinforcing the message that he wanted a peaceful resolution. The presence of witnesses, the clarity of his communication, and his steady composure were all contributing to the slow but noticeable shift in the dynamic. Minutes passed, and Brock remained vigilant. He understood that the situation was delicate and could change quickly. He continued to speak clearly, respectfully, and assertively, ensuring that his words reinforced cooperation rather than conflict. Brock's focus on calm communication, patience, and honesty was gradually transforming the encounter from a tense confrontation to a situation that could be resolved peacefully. The officer, now visibly less tense, seemed to recognize Brock's sincerity and composure. Brock continued to maintain eye contact, speak clearly, and move deliberately. He emphasized his willingness to cooperate fully, his desire for fairness, and his hope that TD His misunderstanding could end without further escalation. Brock's approach was simple but effective. Stay calm, stay honest, and maintain control of one's emotions. The pedestrians around them responded subtly. Some offered verbal support to Brock, questioning whether the confrontation was necessary. Others whispered encouragement, reinforcing the positive energy in the environment. Brock appreciated the quiet solidarity, understanding that the presence of a supportive community could influence how the officer behaved. He remained focused on the officer, aware that the encounter was still ongoing, but encouraged by the gradual shift toward resolution. Brock continued walking, maintaining a calm pace and clear communication. He spoke in a firm but respectful voice, repeating key points about his day, his location, and his simple intentions. The officer, now following at a more respectful distance, began to respond with less aggression and more attentiveness. Brock recognized that his patient and human-centric approach was making a difference. He continued to emphasize cooperation, fairness, and understanding, reinforcing the message that escalation was unnecessary. The street slowly returned to a more relaxed atmosphere. The bystanders' initial tension began to ease, and the soft murmur of conversation replaced the previous silence. Brock remained focused, however, understanding that the situation was not fully resolved until it was completely de-escalated. He continued to communicate clearly, calmly, and respectfully, guiding the interaction toward a peaceful conclusion. Brock Lesnar had been walking for several blocks, carefully observing the officer who was still following him at a distance. He knew that even though the tension seemed to be easing, the situation was not completely resolved. Brock remained calm, his body relaxed but his senses sharp, ready to respond appropriately if anything unexpected occurred. He maintained a steady pace and spoke in a calm, respectful tone, reinforcing that he wanted to cooperate fully and that he had no intention of causing trouble. As Brock continued, he noticed a car approaching from down the street. The vehicle slowed and came to a stop nearby. To his surprise, another officer stepped out, this one appearing older and more experienced. Brock sensed a difference immediately. The new officer exuded authority but also a sense of calm, a balance that seemed to contrast sharply with the earlier aggressive approach. The presence of this officer changed the energy on the street. Brock felt a glimmer of hope, realizing that the situation might finally reach a fair resolution. The new officer approached the scene, speaking firmly but with a tone that suggested he wanted to understand what had happened. He asked the first officer to explain the situation, and Brock noticed the tension in the younger officer's shoulders. It became clear that the new officer had come to ensure that the confrontation was handled properly. Brock maintained his composure, speaking clearly and calmly, recounting the events from his perspective. He explained that he had been walking home from training, had no reason to be in trouble, and only wished to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. The older officer listened attentively, occasionally nodding as Brock spoke. He then turned to the first officer, questioning the need for confrontation and reminding him to act professionally. Brock could sense a shift in the dynamic. The first officer, who had been aggressive and rigid, now seemed slightly embarrassed and unsure. Brock continued to speak calmly, making it clear that he wanted no conflict but that he expected to be treated fairly. His tone was firm yet respectful, reinforcing the message that honesty and cooperation could guide the situation to a positive outcome. Brock noticed the reactions of the bystanders. Some whispered among themselves, observing the change in behavior between the two officers. Others continued recording on their phones, documenting the encounter for accountability. Brock understood the significance of these subtle interactions. The presence of witnesses, combined with his composed demeanor, was gradually shifting the energy from confrontation to cautious understanding. He continued to emphasize patience, fairness, and a desire for peaceful resolution. The older officer asked Brock a few questions, speaking in a tone that was professional but not intimidating. Brock answered clearly and respectfully, providing details about his training, his routine, and his simple plan to head home. He maintained eye contact, showing confidence without aggression. Brock's approach reflected the principle that strength could be demonstrated through calmness, clarity, and composure rather than force or intimidation. The dynamic between the officers began to change further, as the first officer seemed to recognize the importance of handling the situation with care. Brock continued walking, carefully guiding the encounter toward resolution. The street, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now had a sense of cautious attention. Pedestrians watched quietly, sensing that the confrontation was nearing a turning point. Brock spoke in a human-centric, engaging tone, emphasizing cooperation, understanding, and fairness. He maintained his calm, ensuring that the interaction did not escalate further. The presence of the older officer provided a stabilizing influence, reinforcing the idea that accountability and professional conduct were necessary. The first officer began to speak more cautiously, asking fewer aggressive questions and showing signs of reflection. Brock continued to respond in a measured, respectful manner, reinforcing that he wanted to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. He explained the sequence of events clearly, providing context and maintaining honesty throughout. The older officer nodded, occasionally interjecting to clarify points and ensure that proper procedures were being followed. Brock recognized that this was the turning point he had been waiting for. The dynamic was shifting, and the possibility of a positive resolution was becoming real. As they continued down the street, Brock noticed subtle signs of change in the first officer's body language. The rigid stance had softened, the harsh tone was replaced with a more neutral one, and his steps were less deliberate and confrontational. Brock maintained his calm demeanor, speaking clearly and steadily, emphasizing that he wanted a peaceful resolution and cooperation. His patience, clarity, and composed behavior were gradually influencing the outcome. The pedestrians around them reacted to the shift as well. Some whispered encouragement, acknowledging Brock's ability to remain calm under pressure. Others seemed to relax, sensing that the confrontation was nearing its end. Brock understood the importance of this communal energy. The presence of a supportive, observant community added accountability and encouraged professionalism in the officer's behavior. Brock continued to emphasize cooperation, fairness, and understanding, maintaining focus on the peaceful resolution he desired. Minutes passed as Brock guided the encounter forward. He continued to explain his actions, his intentions, and his perspective. He remained respectful and firm, ensuring that the officers understood that escalation was unnecessary and that he sought only to resolve the misunderstanding. Brock's composed approach was gradually creating an environment of mutual understanding. The older officer occasionally interjected to remind the first officer of professional conduct, and Brock responded with calm acknowledgement, reinforcing the importance of respectful communication. Brock's thoughts reflected on the lessons of the encounter. He considered the ways patience, composure, and honesty could influence outcomes even in challenging situations. He thought about how easily misunderstandings could escalate and how important it was to maintain control over one's emotions. He recognized that courage in this situation was not about aggression or intimidation, but about staying true to one's principles, communicating clearly, and navigating tension with dignity. Brock's approach exemplified strength through restraint and calm action. The first officer, now visibly more relaxed, began to acknowledge Brock's perspective. His questions became more measured, and his tone less confrontational. Brock continued to respond calmly and respectfully, reinforcing that he wanted to resolve the situation peacefully. The older officer's presence ensured that professional conduct was maintained, further supporting the de-escalation. Brock's patience, honesty, and human-centric approach were successfully transforming the encounter from a tense confrontation to a situation that could be resolved positively. The pedestrians around them appeared more at ease. Some continued recording, while others quietly observed the shift in behavior. Brock appreciated the subtle support, understanding that the presence of witnesses added a layer of accountability that encouraged professionalism. He remained focused on the officers, maintaining calm and clarity, guiding the interaction toward resolution without conflict. Finally, the older officer addressed both Brock and the first officer, emphasizing the importance of resolving misunderstandings professionally and respectfully. He reminded the first officer to consider the situation carefully and to ensure that proper conduct was followed. Brock nodded, continuing to maintain his calm and respectful demeanor. The first officer responded, acknowledging the guidance and showing signs of reflection. Brock sensed that the encounter was approaching a peaceful conclusion. As they continued, Brock maintained eye contact, spoke clearly, and moved deliberately. He reinforced his willingness to cooperate fully, his desire for fairness, and his hope that the misunderstanding could end peacefully. The first officer, now more composed, responded with a quieter, more neutral tone, indicating that the aggressive energy had subsided. Brock's patient, human-centric approach had effectively guided the interaction toward resolution. The street gradually returned to a quieter, more familiar rhythm. Pedestrians resumed their activities, and the sense of tension that had permeated the area began to dissipate. Brock continued walking, reflecting on the lessons learned from the encounter. He recognized the power of patience, composure, and respectful communication. He understood that courage and strength could be demonstrated not through aggression or force, but through the ability to navigate difficult situations with dignity, honesty, and restraint. Brock's thoughts focused on the significance of human connection and accountability. He realized that the presence of witnesses, the support of the community, and the influence of the older officer had all contributed to the positive resolution. He felt a quiet sense of pride in his ability to remain calm and composed, knowing that his actions had influenced the outcome for the better. Brock continued toward home, carrying with him the understanding that even in challenging circumstances, patience, clarity, and respectful communication could lead to peaceful resolution and personal integrity. As the minutes went on, Brock reflected on the importance of patience and composure. He thought about how easily misunderstandings could escalate, and how crucial it was to maintain control over one's emotions. He realized that courage in this situation was not about aggression or intimidation, but about staying true to one's principles, communicating clearly, and handling the encounter with dignity. Brock's approach demonstrated that strength could be measured not only in physical power, but in the ability to navigate difficult situations with calm and integrity. Finally, after what felt like an extended moment of uncertainty, Brock noticed a significant change in the officer's demeanor. The harshness in his voice was gone, replaced by a quieter, more measured tone. His posture had softened, and he seemed to be reassessing the situation more thoughtfully. Brock continued to communicate calmly, reinforcing his desire for a peaceful resolution and his willingness to cooperate. The pedestrians around them appeared relieved, sensing that the encounter was moving toward a positive outcome. Brock walked with deliberate care, maintaining his calm and composed demeanor. He emphasized understanding, cooperation, and fairness, making it clear that he wanted to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. The officer's aggressive energy had diminished, replaced by cautious attentiveness. Brock's patience, clarity, and calm communication had successfully influenced the situation, guiding it toward resolution without confrontation. As the street gradually returned to its usual quiet rhythm, Brock felt a sense of relief, though he remained alert. The encounter had tested his patience, composure, and ability to navigate a tense situation, but he had handled it with dignity and calm. He reflected on the lessons of the experience, the importance of maintaining control over one's emotions, the power of clear and respectful communication, and the influence of supportive witnesses. Brock continued on his way home, carrying with him the knowledge that even in challenging and unfair situations, patience and composure could lead to positive outcomes. The encounter had been a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from restraint, honesty, and human connection. Brock felt a renewed sense of confidence in his ability to handle difficult situations, knowing that courage was measured not only by physical ability, but by the way one navigates tension with dignity and respect. He was no longer aggressive, though he remained cautious. Brock continued to speak calmly, reinforcing his desire for a peaceful resolution and his willingness to cooperate. The pedestrians around them seemed relieved, sensing that the confrontation had reached a turning point. Brock reflected on the lessons of the encounter. He thought about the power of composure, the influence of bystanders, and the importance of clear communication. He realized that situations like this could happen to anyone, and that handling them with patience and respect could make a profound difference. He felt a quiet pride in his approach, knowing that he had maintained his dignity and calm even under pressure. The officer, now visibly less tense, finally allowed Brock to continue on his way, though he offered a brief warning to stay aware of his surroundings. Brock nodded, understanding the caution but also feeling a sense of relief. The tension of the encounter slowly dissipated as he walked away, returning to the rhythm of the street in the quiet evening. The pedestrians resumed their activities, but the moment lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. Brock continued toward home, reflecting on the power of restraint and the importance of standing firm in truth. He thought about how patience, composure, and human connection could change the course of a confrontation, even when faced with authority and aggression. The encounter had tested him in ways that were different from the ring, but the lessons were equally valuable. He felt a renewed sense of awareness and gratitude for the ability to navigate challenges with dignity, and he knew that this experience would stay with him for a long time. And honesty, knowing that these were his best tools in this unusual fight. Minutes felt like hours as the interaction continued. Brock remained steady, his breathing controlled, his words measured. He refused to let anger dictate his actions, understanding that reacting aggressively would only reinforce the officer's hostility. Instead, he stayed grounded, using reason, clarity, and composure to navigate each challenge presented by the officer's accusations. Slowly, the situation began to feel less volatile. The officer, though still skeptical, seemed to be reconsidering his approach. Brock maintained eye contact, spoke in a calm voice, and stayed firm in his stance without being confrontational. The surrounding crowd began to relax slightly, sensing that Brock's patience and presence were helping to de-escalate the tension. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer took a step back. Brock continued to speak calmly, reinforcing his willingness to cooperate and his desire for a peaceful resolution. The atmosphere, while still tense, began to shift from confrontation to cautious understanding. Brock felt a wave of relief but knew that the situation wasn't entirely over yet. He remained alert, aware that any sudden move could reignite the tension. Brock's approach was simple but effective. Stay calm, stay honest, and maintain control of one's emotions. He had faced many opponents who tried to provoke him, and he knew that the real strength often came from restraint and clarity rather than force. In this moment, his training, experience, and patience were his greatest allies. The encounter was a powerful reminder of how quickly misunderstandings could escalate and how important it was to remain composed in the face of aggression. Brock walked away from the situation still tense but proud of how he had handled himself. The street slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, and the people who had witnessed the scene went about their evening with something to talk about for days. Brock continued home, reflecting on what had just happened. He thought about how easily a confrontation could have turned violent, how the presence of witnesses played a role, and how his calm and measured approach had changed the outcome. The experience stayed with him, a reminder of the importance of patience, composure, and standing firm in truth, no matter how intimidating or unfair the situation might feel.